I'm going to comment first. I'm going to be talking about U.S. domestic postal history of postal, reply postal, and postcards. Ken Lawrence and I are kind of good buddies on this whole thing. He does the early stuff, and I'm much more interested in the history and later on. And he had a real nice Lynn's article earlier in the year, but he only went up to 1910. And I've been fortunate enough to write a couple of recent books in which I have some chapters on unmailable and undeliverable cards. And I just absolutely, I love anything that I don't understand that I can learn. Like if you guys send me a question about a cover, I love that because it means I have to do research. And so there's a tremendous amount of research that I've done in writing these chapters. And I still keep running into all kinds of neat things. Anyway, welcome. And what I'm going to talk about is 3 kinds of domestic cards. The postal card that was originally produced in 1873. Then the reply postal, those were finally introduced by our postmaster in 1892. And then in July 1st of 1898, the post office introduced allowed postcards. And so those are the 3 I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how they were handled when they were not mailable and when they were undeliverable, because that's where all the interesting things happen. Now, the thing that really drives me nuts is that the post office always seem to denigrate cards. And when I say denigrate, they were always coming up with odd rules that they were allowing about how cards could be used. And it was just amazing to me how they got right in the face, even from the very beginning, about cards. But on the other hand, that meant there are all kinds of constant new rules that were developed over the years, including the ones that I found out about. Unfortunately, what makes it really a problem is that almost every 10 years, they handled cards differently. And I gave Paul a handout, which you may not have gotten yet, but if you want to get it probably, because it lists all the kinds of unmailable cards, all the categories, and all the categories of undeliverable cards. Also, my book, I'm going to be presenting them and talking about them on this talk, but it can get almost overwhelming. There's so many changes in terms of how unmailable cards are handled. So anyway, first I talk about all the varied ways the cards were unmailable. And, I'll discuss those in detail. There's about 8 categories. And then those all occurred at the offices of mailing. Then I'll talk about the offices of delivery, where there were frustratingly frequent and illogical ways of the card types were undeliverable. And you'll see how crazy it must be. If you get frustrated by the confusion, by the complexity, keep in mind that there's a Q&A afterwards. This is being recorded, and there is that handout that I've given that is available through Paul. And my book, Insights into U.S. Postal History, you don't have to write it down or anything like that, but that the APS library, they sell it. what I did is I donated it to them, and they have that one, and actually most of my books for sale, and they have a good rate on them. So if any of you are APS members, you could buy it from them. But like I said, I think the handout is pretty helpful. Okay, here is the list of the types of ways that cards were unmailable. The first kind, and then there's no logic to the order I have them in. I've tried to do them chronologically, but then I realized it was way too confusing because of the way the post office kept changing things. Anyway, the first kind of card that was considered unmailable is one that is badly addressed. Now, that can be from no address at all to the wrong state, to the wrong city, to an illegible address. Anyway, and after 1887, anytime a card came into the post office and was badly addressed, it was returned for a better address from the writer, the sender. And the sender, in some cases, corrected the address. In some cases, didn't bother. Next, there's the cards that were returned for postage. In other words, they were paid less than one rate. Now, when you think about it, the postcard rate was 1 cent originally. So, people had to be pretty cheap not to pay any postage at all. Keep also in mind, though, that postal cards, even though they started in 1873, always had an indicium on them. In other words, they came paid. Now, there came a point in which the rate became 2 cents in 52. And then in that case, someone could use an old card and be short paid. But generally, it was only on postcards that were short paid or unpaid and returned for postage. And so starting in July 1st, 1898, when the cards were allowed, that's when this started happening. Then in 1974, there's a new rule, and that was that only unpaid cards could be returned for postage. A partially paid card from 74 on was not returnable for postage, had to be sent to the addressee, in fact. Okay, next was, and you'll say I've got 3 examples of this, where the writing was on the address side and make it unmailable. Or after 1907, they put a line down the middle of cards, and if the writing went over the line into the address area, as you'll see, that could really be confusing. And so they would call it unmailable. When I say unmailable, what did I mean? I meant that they would return it to the writer and ask for letter postage. So it wasn't really unmailable, it was unmailable as a card, but it could be mailed as a letter. And then next, starting in 1907, the cards had already been around a while, but they started putting glitter on them. And the glitter would get into the machines and wreck the machines that were canceling. And so they made them, any card that was unmailable, had the glitter on it, became unmailable unless they returned to the writer and the writer put it in an envelope and then paid the letter rate. Then it was okay because it wouldn't affect the machines. Before 1876, card, you couldn't put any tag. This is a good example of how they were abusing cards. You couldn't put anything, any tag on a card before 1876. After 1876, they would allow you to put an address label on a card. And then in 1913, if the cards were really, if the attachment rather was really thin, you could paste it on after 1913, even if it wasn't an address. And finally, obscene or scurrilous cards. These were never returned to the writer, by the way. They went to the dead letter office. And I'm going to show one, and you're going to ask yourself, why in the world, how in the world can I show it? Well, because what happened was the dead letter office sold a lot of things as waste, and that got into collectors' hands. Now, this is where things start getting real complicated, because there's so many. Here I discuss all the different ways and the situations in which various cards could be sent back to were undeliverable and could be sent back to the writer. It turned out this constantly changed. And again, this is on your handout. So you'll get this eventually. First place, before 1887, there were no undeliverable postcards. If any card was undeliverable before 1887, they just threw it away. And that again is the kind of attitude they had towards cards. Okay, now from 1887 to 1893, during that short period of time, any card, in this case, of course, only postal cards, because that's all that exists, those could be returned, and they were freely returned. But then after 1893, they stopped. And till 1902, they wouldn't return any undeliverable card of any kind until 1902. Then in 1902 to 1913, only reply paid postal cards that were undeliverable could be returned, and they were returned free. The others, they just threw away. And and then we keep going, 1913 to 24. They added local cards that were undeliverable to the reply paid cards that could be returned. And by the way, I'm going to be showing examples of all these, so it's not, but first I wanted to get this list to you because it's for your benefit, because it's so complex. Okay, from 24 to 41, again, local undeliverable cards could be returned, all kinds of local cards, but none of the non-local cards, including the reply paid cards. The only way they could be returned was by guaranteeing. This is the first time they started allowing people with senders to guarantee the return. But to do that, they had to be willing to pay, in this case, the card rate, which was 1 cent, then 2 cents eventually, then 3 cents, then 4, then 8, then 10. I've got examples of all of those actually. So they could return non-local cards that were undeliverable, but they had to pay money for it. And it's really kind of interesting. I found out about this 10 years ago, and I was looking at every dealer for examples of this kind of thing, and I could find no dealer that had them or even knew about them. And then finally, a gathering showed me a card that they put on their stock in 1988. That was 30 years before, 20 years before. And that was a card where the return was guaranteed. And that was the first one I ever saw. And since then, actually, they've become fairly common after 1941. But from 1924 to 41, they're incredibly rare. I found 2 in all the searching. Okay, now here's the reminder. The list isn't over with yet. From 40, we still have more time to go through. 41 to 55. Now it turned out all undeliverable cards had to be guaranteed for the return. And that meant 1 cent for each card initially. And then in 52, when the rate went to 2 cents, that was 2 cents. Okay, now 55 to we keep going because it keeps changing. No change in the last period, except now reply paid cards were again allowed free. From 70 to 85, I won't go into the complexity because it's so bad. But basically, no longer did, in most cases, did they put in the return address, return guaranteed. But there were all kinds of, and you'll also one, there were all kinds of things. And again, you have to go to my, in this case, you have to, whoops. Someone, okay. Unless I've been muted, I'll keep going.
No, you're good, Tony.
Okay.
I just heard a little ding, but I think we're okay.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't here. So anyway, from 70 to 85, the return policies depended on an incredible number of variables, and the details, unfortunately, are so complicated. They are in that book that I mentioned initially. Finally, on February 17, 1985, the post office capitulated and now returned all cards free, whether they be local, non-local, reply paid, postal, or postcards, whatever they were, they could be returned. Okay, now I'm going to go through each of the cards, the unmailable types, and the various time periods for undeliverable types. First thing is we discuss the first type, which is the misdirected card. That was the misaddressed card. So in theory, that wasn't allowed to 1887, when from then on, they could be returned for better direction. From 1887 to present, if it was a bad address, the post office would send it back to the writer, and they could then correct it if they wanted to without any charge. In many cases, they did not correct it. It turned out that even though it supposedly wasn't allowed, I do have an 1882 example here that was from Chicago, and notice the state is wrong. I think it's Dakota Territory, and the correct state was Montana. So it was returned to the writer, who changed the state to the right state, and the card was then remailed free. Again, totally illegal, and it's the only one I've ever seen before 1887. Okay, then after 1887, a badly addressed card could be returned for better directions. So here's an 1892 card that was originally addressed to Maryland, and the address was incorrect. I assume the post office recognized that and sent it back to the writer, and he changed the address to Maine, the correct state, and the card was remailed free. Here's another 1892 card. Now it's got an address on it right now, but when it was first mailed, there was no address. Notice the Chicago said received without address. And so they returned it back to him, and the writer put the correct, put an address, which was the correct address, and the card was remailed. Okay, again, as I said, from 1887 on, this ruling for misdirected mail continued. This was very typical they would mail it to an office that was not a real office in the state. And the post office had a lot of directories and found out that was wrong, but they didn't know which one was right. So they sent it back to for correction, and it was remailed free again. Now here's one that was not remailed. It was an 1898 card that apparently was returned. There was no such post office in the state named, so it was returned for better direction, not better. This is another phrase that was used. The correction was not made so the card was not remailed. I'm sure that the collector must have saved the card. Okay, here's another 1912 card. Some of these are quite interesting. Again, no such office in the state named. And so the post office wrote misdirected. And they also said, note, this address is not correct. Please correct it. The writer did not correct it, so the card was not remailed. Now, I'm a little confused about this one. It was a letter, Baltimore letter to Harrisburg, and apparently maybe it was mailed to the wrong person, so it was returned, and whatever the correction was made, it must have been remailed. I'm not quite sure exactly what happened here. And here's another one that was not corrected and therefore not remailed. It's from I think it's 34, yeah. And it was returned from Cleveland, Ohio, because there was no such office. And the writer did not correct the letter, so it was not remailed. This is a kind of interesting one because the post office, those of you who are lived in California know that Fullerton is a California city and probably not a Colorado city. So the post office in Denver noticed, oops, that can't be right. And so they made the correction. And there's actually a note saying it was a deficiency was corrected in the post office. So it did not really get returned for a better address because they knew it. And it got remailed correctly too. Here's another one of those no address. And in this case, the writer, when it was held for better address, didn't correct it, so the card was not remailed. And here's another one where the card was not remailed. If you look at the address, it's a 1997 card and its postage is paid, but there's no city or state listed. So obviously they have a little problem trying to mail it, so they return it for a better address. The address was not corrected, so the card was not remailed. Now, next we got to the cards that were paid less than one rate. So this had to be, remember, this had to be postcards. Couldn't be until 1952. It couldn't even, it couldn't be a postal card. So from July 1st, anytime a postcard was inadequately paid, it got returned to the writer for postage. And by the way, I mentioned incidentally, because we're going to see an example, after 74, the postal bulletin indicated only unpaid card could be returned for postage. So a partially paid card had to be sent on to the addressee who paid postage. By the way, and this is kind of, I don't know how many of you get the frustration of a letter not being sent to you or not mailed, not delivered to you, because the post office doesn't make any efforts anymore to correct a problem. In 1902, if there was no return address, especially on postcards, and that you can imagine that was fairly common, if the sender be known or can be conveniently ascertained by the postmaster and is within the delivery of the office, the letter or package will at once be returned to him for proper postage. In other words, as of 1902, they made a real extraordinary effort to return it if they could. They certainly wouldn't do that nowadays. I don't think they would. At least they haven't in my case. Here's another private mailing card or postcard. They were called private mailing cards originally, but postcard, where there was no postage. So it was returned for 1 cent postage. They notice there's no return address, but this must be a small enough city at the time that the postmaster knew who to return it to, and the postage was returned and the card was remailed. Notice all they had to do was pay the postage. They didn't have to pay any extra. Here's the one where they were short paid. And this was war tax period, so that was a 2 cent rate. But when it was returned for postage, the sender did not send the postage in, so it was not remailed. This is kind of a strange one. It's a 1926 postcard. You might be aware that from 25 to 28, the postcard rate was actually 2 cents, whereas the postal card rate was 1 cent. This is only for three years. So this card was paid originally with 1 cent, which was not enough for the time. So it was returned for 1 cent postage. And the writer was lazy, or all he had was 2 cents. So he then sent 2 cents in. So he overpaid the amount that was due. But the point was he paid enough that it got remailed. Now here's another card where, if you look carefully, I think some of the strange things happen. This was a card from 1953. The rate then was 2 cents. So the postage due was 2 cents. Now there's a mark on there saying return for postage, but I don't think that really happened. I think they returned, because look at the bottom. This is the mail for which you sent postage. And in fact, if you look carefully, I think there's a held for postage somewhere. Anyway, this card was held for postage from the addressee, and the addressee sent the 2 cents, and then the card was remailed to them. So even though they put the return for postage, that didn't work, because apparently the writer didn't want to pay it, or for some reason didn't pay it. Okay, here's a 1983 card, and I was looking through all my cards because I wanted to find something like this. Remember what I said from 1974 on, only cards that were unpaid could be returned for postage. This card was originally unpaid completely, the 20 cent postcard rate. And so it was returned for postage, and the meter was used to pay the postage. So then the card was remailed. So if the card had been only partially paid, it would have had to go on to the addressee. Again, I don't understand that, but that's the way it was. In fact, I looked it up in the postal bulletins to make sure that I was right. And indeed, it said very carefully that this was true. Here's another card that was returned for postage, because now you're saying to yourself, wait, there's a 20 cent stamp on there. Well, it was covered with tape, which made it invalid postage. So notice they say that on the tag label, postage is invalid. So because it was not cancelable. And so actually it probably was cancelable. So in some ways, because obviously the cancel did cover it originally. But anyway, it was returned for postage because it was unpaid, because they have an invalid postage. The writer did not send the postage that was due, and so the card was never remailed. Now we get to the next type of unmailable card, which had writing on the address side, and or especially after 1907, writing across the center line. Notice before 1881, it was not a abnormality, but I've never seen a pre-1909 issue example. I've only got a few. Oh, I've got a few though. They're really hard to find, but they're really kind of fun to find too. eBay has them every once in a while. Here's a 1909 card. Well, notice the writing is barely over the center line. So when you think about it, it's really not that obnoxious or that illegal, you would think. But it was the only way these could be mailed was by letter rate. And in this case, the letter rate was 2 cents. So it was returned for the 1 cent postage to make up the rate. And the person who wrote over the bill sent the 1 cent, so it could be remailed at the letter rate. Now, this is a good example of why the rule. Notice the writing is all over, and it's real difficult to see the address. And that's the reason why this ruling existed. So it was returned for postage to pay the letter rate in this 23 card. The person who wrote over the center didn't send the postage, so the card was not remailed. And finally, here's a really great example. The card is a postal card, not just, and notice that the person did circle the address. So you'd think, the post office would have made an effort, but they said, no, this is not right. The writing is clearly on the address side in a very bad way. So they returned for the letter rate, which was 3 cents. So they returned for 2 more cents. It was paid, and the card was remailed as a letter. Now, these are hard to find, but they're wonderful. And that's initially, they wouldn't allow anything, any tag or any adhesive material applied. Try that again. Wait a moment, I'm getting into myself. We're discussing here cards with tinsel, sand, mica, or metal or glass on them. So after 1907, they began to realize these kind of cards were wrecking the machines. And so they would return to the writer and say, you've got to put it into an envelope, and then you have to pay the letter rate. And so we have a couple examples that do not show the glitter, but this card has glitter on the other side. It was unmailable. It was returned to the writer, and he was supposed to put it into an envelope. And he may have, and there's no way of knowing that. But the next one is a 1923 postcard where it's pretty clear what happened. Again, there was unmailable, but notice it was returned to the writer, and notice what the writer said. This card was returned on account of tinsel, and so I had to put it in an envelope. So he did put it in. She did put it in an envelope, Dorothy, so it was then mailable at the letter rate within an envelope. So that's a rather cute card because the person recognized what happened, and you can tell they used an envelope. Okay, now we're getting to the pasted on matter. And as of 1913, the pasted on matter could be really thin. And before 76, it wasn't allowed at all. From 76 to 1913, the address could be pasted on. Whoops. Okay, well, here's a 1904 card. And notice that in the address part, in the message part, there is something that was pasted on. And so it was considered unmailable. It was this is, by the way, a local letter. It was returned. That doesn't matter, though. It was true whether it was local or not. It was returned to the writer. And again, these could be mailed at the letter rate. So they weren't completely unmailable, but it had to be mailed at the letter rate. And the one cent postage too, by the way, indicates that the writer paid the 1 cent that was due, and that's what it usually means when it's placed like that, especially on a local letter. So they ended up paying the letter rate that was due in order to mail the card with the pasted on matter. Well, here's a 1913 postcard where the add-on pasted on is really quite thick, not thin. So it was, in theory, it was allowed, a pasted on material would be allowed if it were thin, but it was not in this case. And so it was returned as unmailable. And notice that an extra cent was placed by the writer. And so the writer was willing to pay the letter rate for this particular card, and the card was remailed. Now, this is kind of humorous because I think that at the time they had a really different idea what obscene meant. But supposedly from the very beginning, if a card had obscene or there was some kind of negative attacking comment on it, it couldn't be returned to the writer, but was actually sent to the dead letter office. By the way, how in the world, if it was sent to the dead letter office, you might ask, how in the world do we have it? Well, it turns out if you look at the postal guides and postal bulletins, they're constantly mentioning the fact that extra paper is sold as waste. And so undeliverable letters and unmailable letters were frequently sold as waste, even if they went to a place where they wouldn't be delivered. Anyway, this is a card from 1906, and you can say to yourself, "What? There's something obscene about it." But if you look really closely, it says Daisy with their little bear behind, and I guess that was considered sort of obscene in a very, very obscure way, and so the card was unmailable. Now we get to the undeliverable group, and in every case, I do have beautiful examples of the cards that could be returned and cards that couldn't be returned. Now, before 1887, there were no undeliverable cards that could be returned. In fact, if a card was undeliverable before 1887, it was actually destroyed in that case. But in 1887 to 1893, all cards could be returned if they were undeliverable, and they would return free. And I'm going to say this right now because from 1893 to 1902, no cards could be returned. So, okay, but now here's, by the way, before 1893, they did not have to write the reason for the return. So here's the first card during that period from 1887 to 1893. It was undeliverable. We don't know why, but it was returned to the writer as undeliverable, and it was returned free. Notice the reason for the fact it was undeliverable did not have to be stated. Here's an 1892 card in that short time period. Again, it was undeliverable. It was returned free. I have no cards from 1893 to 1902 that were returned because none were supposed to be returned. However, starting in 1902, and again, you've got your handout, which lists all these different requirements and allow what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. But from 1902 to 1913, only double cards, in other words, reply paid cards, could be returned free. And I happen to have one. Here's a card. Here, and this is a double card, reply card. You can actually see well, I can't think of the word now, darn it. Okay, but anyway, it's clearly a double card, and it was undeliverable. And notice there was a reason for the non-deliverability. There should be, not there. So the card was returned free because, again, it was a reply paid postal card. That was the only kind of card. A regular postcard or a regular postal card could not be returned. Okay, but already by 1913, we got to change because now not only were reply paid cards returnable free, but local cards could be returned free during this period from 1930 and 24. Here's a local Philadelphia card that was undeliverable and it was unclaimed. So it was returned because it was local and it was returned free, but it was also returned. You couldn't, I have not seen the other kind because there aren't any non-local returns allowed during this period. By the way, this is really kind of interesting. It's kind of incidental. The statement, do not use this envelope or wrapper again, really means if you remailed the item, you had to put new postage on. So you could use this wrapper or letter envelope if you put new postage on it. And I've got examples later on where they do that. So that's really, this kind of statement, which is very common, is not really correct for this 1920 card. And here's a 1923 card, local again, Philadelphia. And again, it was unclaimed, but it was a local card, so it could be returned free, and it was. And here's a 1924 card in the same actual period. And it's a local card again, and it was unclaimed. In this case, it's actually a reply paid card. So it's doubly, it was a return for two reasons. One, that the reply paid return was allowed, and the fact that it was a local return was allowed. So for two reasons, it could be returned free. Things start to get well, I think they're interesting already. I mean, I had so much fun collecting all these different histories, postal histories. But from 24 to 41, things got really got different. Again, local undeliverable cards, all three types could be returned, but no non-local card could be returned, except if the return was guaranteed. So we begin to find this guaranteed idea where if you paid the postcard rate, in this case 1 cent, and guaranteed it in your return address, you could then get a card return, but it wasn't free anymore. First, though, here's a card from that period from 1926. It was a local card. It was unclaimed, so undeliverable, and could be returned free because it was a local card. Here's another local card, 32. Again, it is a postal card, and it was unclaimed, but could be returned free because of the local. This is a wonderful card. I searched forever for this kind of card because it's before 1941. It's a non-local card. And notice in the return address, return postage guaranteed. So this card was a non-local card from Columbus to Lancaster, Ohio, but it could be returned, not free, after it was undeliverable because the deceased, the addressee was deceased, but because the guarantee was made, it could be returned. Now, how do I know it was returned? Because there is a 1 cent postage due stamp. And when the 1 cent stamp is placed, that meant that the 1 cent that was collected, that's how that was indicated at the time for this kind of card. Now from 41 to 55, yet another change. Now all cards that were undeliverable had to be guaranteed for the return, and they had to pay the postcard rate. And before 1952, it was 1 cent, and from 52 to 55, it was 2 cents. This is the kind of card that I salivate over. I did until I realized they're much more common than I thought. But they weren't originally. They were, like I said, I found that one from 1988 in the gatherings stock. But lately, there have been a lot of them available. Anyway, this is a 1946 reply paid card that was mailed out to a lot of people. Notice the return postage is guaranteed by the Copper Company. And okay, why the 17 cents? Well, this card was unclaimed, but there actually were 17 cards returned that were unclaimed. And the writer had to pay 1 cent for each card that was returned. And that's why the 17 cents for the post office to return 17 cards that were undeliverable. Here's another postal card. That was a reply paid card. This is a postal card where it was Chicago, it was undeliverable. But again, the 10 cents, that means 10 cards. Notice the return postage guaranteed. There's that indication in the return address. And there were 10 cards returned in this case. Now, here's a postal card, a 1 cent postal card from 1952 after the rate went up to 2 cents. And so the Dr. Thompson paid the 2 cents. And so that's not why this was returned. This was returned because it was again a stack. And notice there's 18 cents paid. So that meant there were 9 cards returned at 2 cents per card. So it depended on what rate was. But I have one later on where there's a 3 center. So the 3 cents was due to return the card. So it really depended upon what the postcard rate was at the time. Now this was true all kinds of cards. So I've been able to show you a reply paid card where this is done, then a postal card. And here's a postcard that was mailed, a return postage guaranteed at the 2 cent rate with the Prexy. And again, it was undeliverable. And 4 cents were collected from the writer. So 2 cards were returned in this case. It's a little bit unusual to see a postcard where this is done. they're more likely to be postal cards because there often were mailings of one kind or another. Okay, in 1955 to 70, another change. Again, all cards had to be guaranteed return, except that undeliverable debit cards were again allowed to be returned free. I don't have an example, unfortunately, of the debit card, but I do have, and by the way, they're really harder. After you get up to 1958, it's really hard to find these. And in many cases, I've actually been given the images by friends, although now I do have an example of my own, but it took me 10 years to get that example. And so here's a 59 local card. So it didn't matter, again, it's not a reply paid card, it's a local postal card at the 3-cent rate. It was undeliverable, no such number. And so the return postage was guaranteed as required. And so the writer paid the 3 cents that was due to get it returned to him. I don't have, that's the only one I have because they're so hard to find. In fact, that's going to be true of the next couple. Starting in 1970, things got really complicated, as I mentioned earlier. If they weren't complicated enough already, they got to the point where the statements that were made in the return address got really complicated. And depending upon what the statement said, they might have to pay a fee, they might have to pay the postage, part of the card postage, or they couldn't get no return. So starting from 70 to 85, things got really complicated. And to actually get the actual rules and regulations, you really have to get my book because it's so complicated. Anyway, here's a lovely 75 card where, notice it doesn't say return postage guaranteed, it says address correction requested. So there were all kinds of possible statements that could be made on a card. And in this case, the statement did not allow that the postcard rate was paid on the return, but rather a fee of 10 cents was paid. And that's what happened in this case. The undeliverable card moved, left no address, and the library had to pay 10 cents not, and notice that you can tell what the rate was. The rate was 8 cents because this is an 8-cent postal card. So this was not a return postage guarantee type of usage. So that's why I say it gets pretty complicated, and I just didn't have space for all the rules. Same thing in 79, 85. The rules for return were complicated, but the return postage guarantee was one that was allowed, and among others. Again, to get the full details, you have to go to my book. But anyway, from 79 and 85, undeliverable cards could be returned only in certain circumstances. Actually, it's really kind of interesting. To me, it's kind of interesting. It's a 1980 card, and the rate was 10 cents. The postcard rate was 10 cents. Notice the return postage guaranteed is not printed, but it's actually just a label, not a label, but a hand stamp. But it was all that was needed. And so, because this card was not deliverable as addressed, it was undeliverable. And so that we actually have an example of this older kind of ruling where the person had to pay the postcard rate to return the postcard. In this case, they paid the 10-cent rate. Well, believe it or not, finally, the postcard got its act together. The post office got its act together, And as of February 17, 1985, any card, whether local, non-local, postcard, reply card, or postal card, could be returned free. And I got two examples of that I was able to find. Here's from September 1985. So this is about 8 months later than that postal bulletin announcement. And this card was attempted not owned. It was undeliverable. It was at the rate, in this case, I don't know, I'm not sure what the rate is because it's a, card, a non-denominated card. But anyway, that's not the point. The point was that the return was free. And so when they returned it, they didn't pay anything. And this is kind of cute because here's a card that was mailed to a place that was a false representation place. In other words, it was for some reason or another, mail was not allowed to be delivered there. So this reply card was returned. It was 1986 business reply card. And again, it was returned free because all cards are returned free at this point. Well,
notice the hand cancel on that one about philately and the family.
Right. Yeah, yes, that's really cute. I noticed that. Also, permit no longer valid, return to sender. So there's a number of reasons why this was returned, but it's really cute. But you're right. It's really kind of humorous. Okay, now almost in here. I've got a couple of miscellaneous uses, which are kind of rather, it's just hard to characterize. It turned out around the turn of the century, if a postcard, they really denigrated postcards. And so if a postcard had the word postal card on it, or it had United States on it, it was considered unmailable. And so this card from 1904 was unmailable, and it was returned to the writer and could not be remailed again. So that's why I put it in this kind of weird situation. It's really kind of neat when you see these. They're not rarely rare, but they're fun to see. And then finally, without going into details, though anyone who collects airmail postcards knows the fun of collecting them before 1949 because they required the letter rate. In this case, they paid the postcard airmail rate. They paid some amount less than the letter rate and with the 6-cent stamp. So it was really due 2 cents or 8 cents because the airmail rate was due. And so the letter rate was due rather. And so the 2 cent was either, I'm not sure who it was collected from the, because there's no return for postage and there's no, this mail was held. So, but anyway, someone paid it because the 2 cent rate, postage due stamp indicates that. Okay, that's the end. Let me just, I want to comment again that if anyone is really interested in this, and I know that Ken Lawrence and I really enjoy collecting these things, but I think a lot of people who collect postcards or postal cards collect them for the card themselves and not for the postal history. But we both think that the postal history is just really, really fun to try to find and to ferret out. It took me a long time, not a long time, but it probably took me 5 years of researching to understand everything I saw. especially because, things like sometimes it had to be a local card to be returned. Sometimes it had to be guaranteed to be returned. And sometimes it could only reply P cards can be returned. And so you get these cards and you have to really ferret out why there's a problem. Okay, well, that's my presentation. I'm open to any questions if anyone has any.
Questions, people?
I have a question.
Sure.
Bob Toll, on the postcard that was unmailable because it had the words postal on it. I know that the New York postmaster in 1892 or 93 put that ruling out, but I've never been able to find the exact ruling in the postal laws and regulations for that,
Huh.
for postal card and or US.
Could you do me a favor? You're Bob Toll, you're TOA to, I think I know who you are.
TOAL, yeah.
Let me give you my email address and send me, or that way I can get your email address.
Okay.
Tony, WAWRUK. So Tony, WAWRUK @gmail.com. I think I have to look that up because we've got a number. I'm the editor of the Auxiliary Markets Club newsletter, and we've published a couple of cards like that in the past. And I think I've actually looked at postal bulletins or somewhere and found something.
I've seen the statement by the New York postmaster in the New York Times during the time of the Columbian Exposition, but I couldn't find it elsewhere.
Well, that's a great question. It's the kind of question I love, and so there's a number of places you can look, and I would look. You can look I'm going to look in postal bulletins. We have the postal guides. You may be aware that we now have the monthly postal guides available. And anyway, so there's a number of places I can look, and I seem to remember, but so Bob, send me an email, and then I'll look it up for you.
Yeah, TONYWAWRUK.
Yes, at
gmail.com.
And if you get lost, just send it to me and I will be glad to send things back and forth.
Thank you, Paul.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tony. Question I have is, you were showing some postcards that didn't have addresses on them and they said return for further information. A couple of them look like they're picture cards. Did many postal cards have return addresses?
No, in fact, rarely. I would say maybe 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 have returned. I commented because that 1902, the PLNR in 1902 said that if the postmaster knew who wrote the card and the person was in their mailing area, they could return the card. And some of these cities are really tiny. These cities and towns are really tiny, and the postmaster would know everyone.
Made me think. I have a, if you can see it, 1840. I'm sending it to a friend, and it was addressed to the guy's name. It said near Monroe, Butler County, Ohio. That was the address, and it got it. Now it was 1840. No auxiliary markings is obviously got there. So yeah, with the small towns, they know everybody. They could probably tell by handwriting.
Well, and what's really amazing is I'm writing a book on New York markings, auxiliary markings, and it's amazing before 1955 how much effort the post office made to try to deliver something.
Yeah.
And of course, nowadays, a letter to mail to me at Wawrukiewicz, there ain't too many of us in the country, doesn't get to me.
No, I have one from World War II era to a mail ballot election time to a soldier in a Navy hospital, and he kept getting transferred, or in a military hospital, he kept getting transferred from place to place. And after about 6 times, it seemed like they got to him. I was impressed.
Yeah, I used to collect the forwarded mail, and it was always, World War II mail in particular, very common, very often, because the person was moving, got multiple postmarks like that.
And mail was so important for the morale.
Yeah, those are great items.
Yeah. Good, thank you. I have a somewhere, and I wish I could find it. Great Salt Lake, and a little about probably 3/4 of an inch by maybe a little less than a half an inch thick sandbag stitched onto the postcard.
Oh yes, yes.
And I can imagine what that would do to the machines.
Well, they required. I have an example for my postage due collection, and you had to send a letter rate.
Okay. Yep.
A kind of attachment.
Yeah, my wife has a friend in England. Her mother mailed her letters, and the sealing wax was pulled off the back because her mother said, "I'm not paying an extra 20 cents at the post office for that." So, yep, they don't want to gum that up. Questions, folks?
Well, I have one thing. Hello?
Yes.
Go ahead. You're on,
Hi.
Hal.
Yep.
Tony?
Yes.
Hi, Tony. Hal Klein.
Hi.
Just want to say thank you personally for all your help on my Prexy questions that I've sent you, on postage due questions. I've wanted to thank you personally for everything. And this is the book he's been talking about. So everybody buy one. It's great. I have 5 of his books. They're wonderful. For anybody who's into postal history, they are must-haves.
Thank you very much.
Nice endorsement, Hal. Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate that. I write the books, and I'm really pleased how well they're received in terms of usefulness. I mean, that's the reason I write them.
I can't tell you how often I've used them.
Well, me too. I got them. I have about 6 books right next to me that I'm constantly looking at.
I've worn the covers off the international and the domestic handbooks.
Yeah, me too. Well, that's why the latest books I published are without cover, because for that reason. But anyway, as I say, as you mentioned, I really appreciate questions like that one about that marking, because I end up having to do research, and I often learn something new. I mean, I'm constantly, and I don't have my books memorized. I'm always opening them.
Well, I thank you for all the help you've given me.
You're very welcome.
Other questions, folks?
Jim here.
Jim, yeah.
Yeah, I had just had 2 come in today, and don't know if you can see it, but it says
Held for postage.
right and down, and apparently the stamp, there was no stamp on it. And down at the bottom, if I can find it here. And somebody either in the post office or somebody contacted the person and got the money, and the stamp was put on it and they forwarded it.
Oh yeah, that's a wonderful.
That was in
item.
1912.
Yes, help for postage is I never, there's so many great markings related to the help for postage. Like if you say, this is the letter you sent postage for, this is the stamp you sent postage for. Anyway, great stuff.
This is I hadn't seen before, is no such post office and state named.
Right. I mean, I showed a couple like that. I mean, It's interesting to me that at the time, the post office, the postal workers knew so much more about what was around, especially, I suppose, if it was their own state. They really knew a lot about, what post offices there were and all. In fact, there were statements you find where they say, if you are sure that it can be that there's a mistake, correct it and write that and down. I love that. I mean, the care they took 100 years ago was so different than today.
I think they should republish that 1902 regulation.
Oh yeah,
You know,
yes. Except there are occasionally, there's still cities where you blink and you pass through.
Yep. Okay, folks, other questions?
Okay, well, anyway, I would just emphasize again that the neat thing about this is all the incredible variety of uses that are out there, and so I got into covers many decades ago, but I don't denigrate anyone who collects stamps, but it sure is fun to collect postal history.
Yeah.
And to learn and to have questions. And there's things things showing up that even now I still have I can't answer every question that comes to me.
And I think we'll have people adding too that they like those covers, especially if there's something inside.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes. I'm the editor of the Exilium Markings Club, and one of the people who wrote a recent article had a letter inside in which she talked about being in love with someone, and the way they said it in 1890 was so different.
Mhm.
They had ways of saying things that were so cute.
And I miss those ways in many ways.
Yeah.
Yep.
Tom McCormick, I've got a quick question on your presentation.
Sure.
You discussed the rules, which are pretty complex for undeliverables. Would that also apply to an item that was marked refused by the person, the addressee?
Oh, absolutely. And refused items are much more difficult to find, but they're always mentioned as a reason for something to be not delivered. Yeah.
Okay,
You don't see it very often, but they are around. And I think sometimes you really wonder because they may have to pay postage like 2 cents was due. And, it seemed to me someone was awfully cheap if they refused a letter because they couldn't pay 2 cents. But that happened. Well, thank you very much. I really,
Tony,
yes.
you had one in there that the state was not on there to a Dr. Bowman.
Yeah, that was probably near the end for some
Right,
reason.
but I think that was a relative of mine who was a family doctor in Trenton, New Jersey. I
Huh,
couldn't read quick enough.
huh. Let me,
It's my grandfather's brother's son.
let's see.
I think I
You have the page number?
No,
Well,
something like that.
What I'm just trying to think. Come on, Tony. Think. Where is it? I mean, it's not that far back. Crap.
That was a pre-printed card that they ran out of room to put the entire.
Oh,
address on.
it was Yeah, and
It was like
yeah,
what you used to see in magazines, but with an address.
yeah, it was
Addressograph.
undeliverable. Oh, wait, it was undeliverable.
Because the state wasn't at the bottom. They ran out of room.
Oh, okay, it's somewhere. Yeah, that wasn't
That's
okay.
California.
Yeah, what is the one? Let's see. Let me think. I know.
The
I
address,
think.
the address was on the right-hand side of the card.
Yeah. Whoops. Come on, Tony. See, I'm getting too nervous here because it's
Hey,
obvious.
don't worry about it. Don't worry
No,
about
no,
it.
no, no. It's. I think I
You
know
can
where.
always send a copy of it to Paul and he'll get it to me so I can look at it.
Yeah, we'll eventually get this up on the website.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll freeze it when I see it.
Wait a minute.
I can't picture it. I can see it in my head, but
Yeah, I can too.
It's toward the beginning.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Keep going.
Let's see.
Keep
Let me
going,
go back.
keep going.
There
There
it
you
is.
go.
No, keep going. There it is.
No, that's it. That's it.
That's it.
University of Texas Southwest
Oh, that's
Medical
Universal.
Center.
Okay.
That's
I was
not,
gonna say-
that's,
Yeah, Harry Hines Boulevard, it runs right through downtown Dallas. I mean, that is
Yeah.
a major highway.
yeah. My own brother lives in Texas, but that's he's too
Yeah,
early
that's,
for his.
that,
So it was mailed. Yeah, you can see it was mailed from LA. And so
Yeah.
the person had
Well, at
no
least now you
idea.
know it was Dallas.
Tom, I'll take I just made a screenshot and I'll try to remember to
that's-
send it to you.
Well, no, it's not my relative. It went by. All I saw was Wayne Bowman. And I started thinking, and there is a Wayne Bowman in the family, but that's not the Wayne Bowman.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's
'cause you
definitely
mentioned-
Dallas, Texas.
You mentioned a different state.
Yeah, I said he was in Jersey, in Trenton, New Jersey.
Yes.
Yeah.
But anyway, I can't remember where I
Hey,
got.
Wayne, I don't know if you can see Tony. I don't know if you can see this. The post office still cares. I got a damaged postcard in the mail the other day.
Yeah, those are wonderful. We have an article about damaged cards lately, and boy, it's amazing how damaged that card can be. And they do have a lot of markings now for that. I'm collecting, like I said, we did an article for the Auxiliary Markings Club on damaged markings, and it was amazing how many there were. And but it's really kind of funny. There was something about New York City about an irregularity, and the number was like 5,000. So you had to think that there were 5,000 irregular cards that went through New York, but it's a huge city. So, I mean, let me just make a comment about how common things could be, but yeah, you never know. Go into a post office and watch how many packages are mailed overseas, how many air parcel posts are mailed, and then try to find one. Because they go overseas, they get torn apart. So, it's really humorous to me that there's a lot of postal history out there that there should be thousands of items, but you can't find one. And that's what I find to be the most fun about postal history. And this is what I do when I write Lynn's articles. I try to show something that's really unusual and really hard to find, so people know what to look for.
Well, you may not find the package, but you could find the stamps that they ripped off and just put off to the side.
Or the stamps they didn't cancel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, thanks again, everybody. I
Thank you,
really
Tony.
appreciated this because I had to, when I was looking at this, I actually gave this talk to the APS, APRL about a month ago. And I had to, as I went through it this time, there were so many things I needed to correct that it was a beautiful opportunity. So I appreciate this.
We're glad you had the opportunity. Hope we can maybe get you back sometime. As you know, we have a very good audience. I think the peak today was 35, plus we have 2 doubles, that's 37. There's several people who were on at the end, so we're probably over 40.
Well, that was great. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah,
Yeah, it was a good group.
we're good. Well, you're welcome to stay on with us for a little bit and enjoy our show and tell, but I think we'd like to have a hand for our speaker, for Dr. Tony tonight. Thank you very much.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's almost dinner time here. So, and my wife really, so I'm going to have to
All right.
sign off.
Well,
Right.
it's probably dinner time out there in Oregon. So, well, thank you again.
Right. You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank
Yep.
you.